This conference will now be recorded.
Tonight I'm going to tell you about a mafia. The Bomber Mafia actually originated in the 30s, but they had an awful lot to do with the American strategic bombing of the Second World War. I'm going to tell you who they were, what they wanted to do, and then I'm going to tell you how well it worked out. Actually, I started with a book written by Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know if any of you have read any of his stuff, but he's a little bit out of plumb with the rest of the ordinary people that write books. The Bomber Mafia was a group of American pilots during the 30s believing that long-range heavy bombing in large numbers was the way to win a war. They were not in keeping with most of the rest of the United States military. Now this group of, and they were in something called the Army Air Corps at that time. Army Air Corps officers were led by a specific person named Haywood Hansell. And what they believed was you could bomb a city more morally through daytime precision bombing. In other words, select specific, usually significant areas to bomb, and you could be very selective about how you did it. So precision bombing is the word that really captures what their intent was. Now they based this premise, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about this piece of equipment called the Norden bombsight. Norden bombsight was developed during the 30s, but it actually, at least in demonstrations, permitted a bombardier to pinpoint a target from 15,000 feet. They could hit within 100 feet of a given target from 15,000 feet. And that's what made them think that precision bombing was going to be the way to win the war. The philosophy failed. It failed because the bombsight, which was so good in theory and even so good in demonstration, failed in combat conditions. Instead of being precision bombing wasn't much different than carpet bombing that the British were using. And it got worse when they went to the Pacific. In the Pacific, they did not know about the jet stream. And the jet stream at the elevations that they were bombing from with 120 knot winds made it impossible for the B-29s to accurately bomb their targets. Curtis LeMay, you all have heard that name, and I'm going to tell you some more about him, was not a member of the Mafia. In the Pacific, he changed strategic bombing philosophy to fire bombing. And that's what the rest of this story is going to be about, is all of the details that go with what I just went over. Now, here's what the Army Air Corps was like in the 20s. It was the aerial warfare component of the Army, and concentrate on the word Army, between 1926 and 1941. It remained a part of the Army when it became the Army Air Forces. And to be fair, I'm not real sure what the difference is between the Army Air Force and the Army Air Corps. What happened was a rift developed between ground-based Army personnel, and remember now, the Army was really led by ground pounders, up to and including Douglas MacArthur, and those who felt that aircraft were being underutilized. The Army Air Corps had 1,200 obsolete planes 900 officers, and 8,500 enlisted men. So in the late 20s, the Army Air Corps was not a significant part of our military. In 1920, the Air Service School was established at Langley Field in Virginia. It relocated to Maxwell Field in Alabama in 1931. At Maxwell Field, they developed a 36-week course for junior and mid-career officers that included military aviation theory. So now they had a school specifically set aside for the Army Air Corps, and they were trying to develop military aviation as a theory base. The bombardment section was influential in the development of doctrine and its application in warfare. The bombardment section is where the Bomber Mafia came from. Now, who were the Mafia? 9 of those schools' instructors became known throughout the Air Corps as the Bomber Mafia. 8 went on to be generals during World War II. They were led by generals to be Haywood Hansell. I'm going to talk quite a bit about Hansell, and Ira Eaker. Conversely, and this is interesting to me anyway, pursuit tacticians were led by Claire Chennault. He was the chief of the pursuit section. And they lost their influence because pursuit aviation during the 30s was very, very insufficient and inadequate. This is when the Germans were developing the Messerschmitt 109 and the FW-190. We were not developing fighter planes with that kind of capability. Precision bombing was the Air Corps' method of becoming autonomous from the General Staff. The General Staff had been guiding the Air Arm in 2 directions. One was support of ground forces, and 2 was defense of U.S. territory. And what the Bomber Mafia wanted to do was get away from that role and get into a role of strategic significance. By 1937, they had developed a bomber to implement that strategy. Initially, it was this plane here called the B-15. And the major difference between the B-15 and what became the B-17 was the difference in the tail. Now, a key player in the Bomber Mafia was this B-17. That's the plane that most of us have heard the most about, I think. If you look at some of the statistics here, I think they're going to surprise you. Its cruising speed was well under 200 miles an hour. It could carry a bomb load no bigger than 6,000 pounds. It could fly at a very high ceiling, but you had to have oxygen masks and oxygen tanks on all of the participants in the airplane once over something like 20,000 feet. It was a 4-engine heavy bomber, and it was developed in the 30s. If you remember Pearl Harbor, a group of B-17s was on the way to Pearl Harbor when the Japanese were on the way to Pearl Harbor, and the radar that picked them up, picked the Japanese up, thought they were the B-17s. To develop the B-17, Boeing aircraft competed against Douglas and Martin for the contract. Boeing outperformed the other 2 competitors. It even exceeded what the Air Corps' performance specs were. However, Boeing almost lost the contract because their prototype crashed. However, they were that impressed with the Boeing model that they ordered 13 more B-17s for evaluation. From its introduction in 1938, the Flying Fortress became the 3rd most produced bomber of all time. The only 2 that were produced more than the B-17 were the B-24. I'm going to talk about the B-24 and the German Junkers Ju-88. Those are the only 2 bombers of which they made more than they made of B-17s. 12,730 B-17s were built in the time frame 38 to 45. At that time, a bomber cost $204,000, which is $3 million in today's currency. Now, I want to tell you about the B-24. I'm not going to talk that much about it later, but if you look at the specifications on the right, you'll see that they were performance. You'll see that the performance of this plane was better than the B-17. Carried a heavier bomb load, had a higher cruising speed. Its sealing on oxygen tanks was more than adequate for what the needs were going to be. It was designed by Consolidated Aircraft in San Diego, California. However, compared to the B-17, the B-24 was difficult to fly, especially at low speeds. And remember, these planes cruised at about 200 miles an hour. It also had a lower ceiling, and it was less robust than the B-17. It was more easily brought out of the air. Air crews preferred the B-17, but General Staff, who was ordering the airplanes, favored the B-24, and they bought it in larger numbers because it was more flexible. There were a lot of things you could do with the B-24, and it performed multiple roles during the war. It served in every branch of the American Armed Forces. It also served in Allied Air Forces and Navies. It was a very versatile airplane. 18,500 B-24s were produced. 4,600 of them were actually manufactured by Henry Ford, I suppose most of them in Detroit. They cost $215,000, slightly more than what the B-17 cost. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about their competitor. Their competitor was a night flyer. The B-17 and the B-24 were daylight bombing planes. Their competitor was the Avro Lancaster. It had a cruising speed very comparable to the first two that I talked about, had a range comparable to them. However, it carried a bomb load half again as much as the B-24 and twice as much as the B-17. The British produced 7,377 of them. It was the mainstay of their nighttime strategic bombing campaign. The Brits did not believe in precision bombing as the Mafia described it. They believed in a whole different set of technologies, and I'm not going to talk about them much until I get to the very end and tell you what at least one pilot thought about the whole concept. It carried a heavier bomb load than either of the other two. Here's some interesting information. It was modified to carry 12,000-pound blockbuster bombs. Neither one of the two I had spoken of earlier would be capable of that. It was actually seriously considered for the atomic bombing missions. When they made the choice for the B-29, they acknowledged the fact that the Lancaster was a proven airplane that would carry it, and instead they chose the B-29 seriously because it was an American-built airplane for an American bomb. Lancasters carried out the bombing raid that sank the battleship Tirpitz in the Norwegian fjords. Specially modified Lancasters carried out the dam buster raids that destroyed the hydroelectric dams in the Ruhr Valley. Neither one of those would have been in the capability of either the B-17 or the B-24. But it was built to fly at night. It flew at night. Now I want to shift gears just a little bit and talk to you about something called the Air War Plans Division. And this is Division Plan number 1. After Hitler invaded Poland, the Mafia actually went to Washington and in 9 days produced this plan, the most important single document in American strategic bombing in the World War II. It was the first of its kind in the world, and it focused on using heavy bombers for precision bombing. Part of it was a component of production requirements for war. We assumed when they made this in 1941, Germany would be the main enemy, and Britain would be the main ally. Within the plan are air power requirements for the entire war, the number of planes, fighters, bombers, and transports, the number of pilots, the tons of bombs, and the potential strategic targets that they were going to go after. So in 1941, they laid down the plan for what was going to happen in World War II in Germany. It specifically targeted what they called choke points. And what they were looking for was specific industries or specific capability that if you took it out, you had made a major impact on the German capability to wage war. It was the template for the air war of World War II. Shifting gears, I want to talk about Carl Norden's bomb sight. I hope you have heard of the Norden bomb sight. But for background, bombing during World War II was most imprecise. They literally threw bombs out the windows. If they got anywhere near their target, it was because they were either right next to it or they were lucky. Carl Norden was a Dutch engineer. He had been educated in Switzerland, and he immigrated to the United States in 1904. The first prototype of his design was delivered to the Navy in Virginia in 1924. It was top secret, and the Norden bomb sight remained a very special secret throughout the war, which did not mean that either the Brits or the Germans didn't have a similar piece of equipment. It just meant that's the way they chose to treat the Norden bomb sight. By the early 30s, he had perfected the bomb sight with extreme accuracy. It was gyroscopically controlled. It was the equivalent of an analog computer in its ability to predict a trajectory of a bomb. It was a very, very sophisticated device. It actually had several thousand high tolerance components. And part of the problem was as they were being manufactured, it was very difficult to maintain those kinds of tolerances, especially once it was in the field. Norden produced 72,000 of those bomb sights. For the Army Air Force alone, they cost $8,800, $135,000 in current money. Here's a piece of information. You can buy one on eBay today for $300. They are about a 30-pound piece of equipment. The precursor to us being involved in the war was the Blitz of London, but a lot came out in that Blitz that might have influenced people in their long-term thinking, but apparently did not. It was the German bombing campaign against the United Kingdom in 40 and 41. Hitler was not that enthralled with bombing opponents. He was enthralled with air defense. He did understand the potential of bombers for strategic purposes. Initially, in 1940, the Luftwaffe attacked RAF Fighter Command. Their intent was to establish air superiority. And at the beginning, they came very close to being able to do that. But he was trapped with his own vision of bombing as a terror weapon. The British retaliated and bombed Germany, and Hitler turned it around and focused on the cities. It failed to break the English resolve as the British retaliated with a similar campaign against Germany. So the Luftwaffe quit going after fighter command, went after the cities, and from then on, the Battle of Britain, and Jerry's going to talk about that in a couple of weeks, eventually turned against the Germans. Allied bombing strategy. Bomber Harris is the man who convinced the English that they could break the German will with nighttime attacks. So the entire English effort during the Second World War were nighttime bombs. The American Air Force, on the other hand, was convinced that precision bombing was best. To accomplish precision bombing, you needed daylight. So for about a year, they operated with the Brits at night and the Americans during the day. And at Tehran in 1943, Churchill advocated that the Americans switch to area bombing at night with the British. He said, you're not accomplishing what you said you were going to do. You're having significant more losses. The thing to do is everybody to join in the affair at night. Ira Eakers, who was a member of the Mafia, wrote a one-page memo to Churchill. Basically, his thesis was, around the clock will give them no rest. If you bomb them day and night, you will do better than if you have a larger day campaign. I mean, a night campaign. Churchill relented. In Europe, the Americans' precision bombing strategy continued. But who were these people? First of all, Hansell himself. He was a major general in the Army Air Corps during World War II. He went to Sewanee Military Academy. Then he went to Georgia Tech. This is him here. He joined the Air Corps in 1928. He was one of the key members of the Mafia during the 1930s. He attended Command and General Staff School as a first lieutenant in 1938. His first command was one of the 3 wings of the 8th Air Force in England. In August of 1944, he became commander of the 21st Bomber Group in Guam. In early 1945, he was replaced, and I'm going to talk about how that took place, by LeMay. He then took early retirement for disability. He retired with the rank of Brigadier General in 1946. Haywood Hansell. Curtis LeMay, he of the bomb them back into the Stone Age mentality. LeMay was the Air Corps general who implemented the controversial bombing campaign in the Pacific. He graduated from Ohio State with a BS in civil engineering. He joined the Air Corps Reserve in 1929. He took flight training at Norden Field in Columbus in 1931. He was not a member of the Mafia. Early in World War II, he was commander of the 305th Bomb Group in Europe. In August of 1944, I think now a major general, he transferred to the China-Burma-India Theater, and he directed the 20th Bomber Command, starting in India, and it then moved into China. They were flying B-29s. He relieved Hansell as commander of the 21st Bomber Group in January of 1945. Later on, he was Chief of Staff of the Air Force. He was Chief of Staff of the Air Force during the early part of the Vietnam conflict. Schweinfurt. I hope some of you have heard about the bombing campaign of Schweinfurt. Now you'll know a little bit more about the details. It was the poster child of strategic bombing. When they talk strategic bombing, they use the Schweinfurt raid to represent it. It was focused on ball bearing manufacturing. Remember, I talked about specific linchpins in the war industry? Ball bearings were considered to be one of the linchpins. Their thinking was without ball bearings, the tanks would come to a grinding halt, the airplanes would stop, etc. Hansell led the Schweinfurt mission, the first Schweinfurt mission, with 236 B-17s. At the same time, and this was on purpose, LeMay led a decoy mission of 146 planes to bomb the Messerschmitt factory in Regensburg. And the idea was the Germans would have to pick which one of the two they were going to resist the most. The Messerschmitt factory was supposed to be the first. The Germans had a fighter fleet of about 400 Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs to contest these raids. The decoy plan did not work. LeMay was supposed to hit about an hour before Hansell hit, but their timing was off. The Schweinfurt raid was 3 hours behind schedule. As a result, the Germans attacked the Regensburg raid. It was over. The Germans landed, refitted, and were back up in the air in time for the Schweinfurt raid. The B-17 losses in this one day were 17%. 60 B-17s were shot down. Not only that, almost 200 of them were damaged. Many of them never flew again. The second Schweinfurt raid was even worse. 20% of the planes in the second raid were shot down. There was no way they could continue that kind of operation. And the problem was they did not have fighter support much past the coast. The Germans just picked the B-17s off. And if you've ever heard how strong the B-17s were in self-defense, don't believe it. The damage to the factories was less than 30%. The lack of ball bearings had no impact on the German war machine. Talked once a long time ago about the movie 12 O'Clock High. It was a World War II movie with Gregory Peck. It's about air crews and the 8th Air Force flying strategic bombing missions against the ball bearing factories in Schweinfurt. In the movie, the squadron has a morale problem. If you remember what those numbers were, 1 in 5 was killed in each raid. That meant that your chances were only 2 out of 5 of surviving those 2 raids. So there was a morale problem. The general was supposed to turn the unit into a successful element of the American war effort. It was adapted from a book called 12 O'Clock High, was written by a pilot who served under LeMay. He was also a staff officer in Eaker's 8th Air Force. Eaker's role as commander of the 8th Air Force led to him being the model for the fictional general in the movie. I want to talk a little bit about the B-29. Look at it and you see some differences. First of all, it has a much higher maximum speed, but it doesn't have much of a higher cruising speed. They all cruised at a little over 200 miles an hour. It has a slightly larger combat radius, but not that much larger. What it has is a different service ceiling, and it has a bigger bomb load capacity. And the way they did that was pressurizing the cabin. Even as the B-17s and the B-24s were being produced, Boeing was developing a larger long-range bomber. And you can tell when you look at it, all it really is an extended B-17. In April of '39, Lindbergh convinced Hap Arnold to produce this new bomber in large numbers to counter German production. The combined elements of a highly advanced design, it had challenging requirements, i.e. the service ceiling and the bomb capacity, had pressure for production, get it out and get it online, and hurried development caused problems. The biggest single problem that they had were the engines. The engines tended to catch fire, and that's a pretty serious problem. And the reason was that the engines were not designed for the slower speeds that it took to get the fully laden plane up in the air and up to altitude. The engines were built with a type of metal that would very easily catch fire. There were a lot of problems early on with the B-29. 30% of the B-29s in combat were lost. You might have heard that very few were lost. Statistically, that's not true. Its best defense was its altitude capability. The B-29 cost more than twice as much as the 24 and 17. 3,820 were actually produced. Now I want to talk about the two bombing commands in the Pacific. First was the 20th Bomber Command, and it was established, they're still thinking strategic bombing now, in India in March of 1944. The problem was India was too far from Japan. So what they had to do was they had to move the planes into China so that they could bomb them in Japan. The problem with that was getting fuel to the planes. All of the fuel for the B-29s that were in China had to be brought across the hump by either C-47s, B-24s, or whatever it took to transport the fuel. And it was very, very hard to keep the 20th Bomber Command in service. Its commander from August to January was Curtis LeMay. So LeMay learned a lot about the B-29 in those 5 months. On the other hand, the 21st Bomber Command was established in the Marianas after Guam was captured. On August the 28th, 1944, Hansell was made the commander of the 21st. His mission was to implement a strategic bombing campaign in Japan or over Japan with B-29s. Small digression, but this is important to the story. The National Defense Research Committee, that's the same crowd that initiated the Manhattan Project, also initiated a program to find a better way to burn things down. A group of chemists at Harvard found a chemical combination at DuPont that exhibited some very unusual characteristics. After a number of experiments, they developed a product in 1942 made of gasoline and 2 coagulating ingredients. Its name is familiar to most of us as napalm. An elaborate test that was done in 1943 demonstrated what napalm could do to a village of wooden structures. And remember, Japan was mostly wooden structures. Hansell, though, in the Pacific, was not ready to change from strategic bombing to firebombing. He would lose his job over that stubbornness. Now, the strategic bombing of Japan and the jet stream. The 21st Bomber Command plan was to destroy the aircraft industry of Japan with high altitude daylight attacks. 4 groups of the bomber wing was set on their first mission in November 44 with 111 B-29s. And what they found was they encountered the jet stream. Winds at speed as high 200 miles an hour. It disrupted formation flying. It made accurate bombing totally impossible. However, Hansell continued. High altitude missions were equally unsuccessful. Hansell was ordered by Hap Arnold to change tactics. He made one napalm attack, but then he returned to precision bombing. His last attack successfully destroyed the entire Kawasaki factory. I assume Kawasaki at that time wasn't making motor scooters. He was replaced by LeMay the next day. LeMay in Tokyo. LeMay, as said earlier, was not a member of the Mafia. He was not married to daylight high altitude strategic bombing. However, his first 3 high altitude raids that he led were failures. So he changed strategy. Instead of daylight bombing from high altitude, he was going to use his B-29s at night at 5,000 feet with incendiary bombs. He painted the undersides of his planes black and left only the tail gunner in place. What he intended to do was come in at night, blacked out, at high speed, drop his incendiaries and get out of Dodge. The campaign of incendiary raids started with the bombardment of Kobe in February of '45, and it peaked with the most destructive bombing raid in history. On the night of 10 March, Operation Meeting House, 280 B-29s destroyed most of eastern Tokyo. It killed 80,000 civilians. They were bombing the city as carpet bombing. 14 of those 279 were lost. From then on, the incendiary raids intensified. In one example, 450 B-29s destroyed 60% of Yokohama in May of '45. The end of the bombing. World War II in Europe concluded with the firebombing of Dresden. I don't know, I've heard of it, but I didn't know very much about the specifics. 1,300 bombers bombed Dresden in February of '45. By then, the German air resistance was very light. The anti-aircraft guns in Dresden had been sent somewhere else. Dresden was basically defenseless. The war in the Pacific concluded with the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of '45. Both of these attacks were aimed specifically at civilians to destroy the enemy's will to continue fighting. A lot of people believe that the bombing of Dresden was done to show the Russians what would happen to them if they did not follow the rules of the conclusion of World War II. Neither of those two were delivered in accord with the strategy of the Bomber Mafia. By then, the Bomber Mafia had been discredited. Armchair historians continue to debate the moral rectitude of these attacks ever since. Epilogue. I thought you might be interested in this. There's a book called "A Thousand Shall Fall," written by a man named Murray Pedden. I've just read it, and it is a very, very good book. He was a Canadian pilot. He flew World War II heavy bombers for the RAF. It is the story in very extensive detail of his training, both in Canada and in England. And the training for a bomber pilot wasn't 16 or 18 hours. Here's your hat, what's your hurry? It was hundreds of flying hours in different planes, slowly building up to a 4-engine bomber. also about his crew operations on night flying. He was flying a plane called the Short Sterling. He also flew flying fortresses, both with the RAF at night. This is an excellent book, and I really encourage you to find a copy and read it. It has been hailed as a classic of war literature. It's a blend of excitement, humor, and tragedy. Very matter of fact, he talks about most of his friends getting killed at one time or another. The death rate for air crews was very high. It describes training on each aircraft needed to become a bomber pilot. It's detailed, obviously came from his logs as a pilot and a personal journal. He quotes people by name over a long period of time. It describes the variety of his 30 combat missions. So he flew 30 missions. Some of his missions were deep penetration raids. Some of them were D-Day interdiction missions. In other words, the bombers were bombing behind the German lines as D-Day was taking place. Then he got involved in something that is called radar jamming. I didn't know anything about the radar jamming missions, but these bombers would fly up specifically to jam German radar for the bombing missions that were going to various cities. He does not think very highly of the precision bombing legends. From his perspective, and he does a pretty good job of explaining how what the British did at night was about as accurate as what the Americans did during the day. He does not think highly of the legend. Now, what is precision bombing today? In the latter part of the 20th century, a recon drone called the Predator was armed with Hellfire missiles. Following 9/11, the drones expanded geometrically. Even by 2002, Al-Qaeda terrorists were being assassinated with a Predator in Yemen. Hundreds, if not thousands, of drone precision tactical strikes have followed. The B-2 Spirit bomber is equipped for conventional precision bombing, as well as the strategic role of nuclear strike. I have never seen a B-2 in flight, but that's what one looks like. It has a sophisticated GPS-aided targeting system. It maps the targets prior to the deployment of something called the JDAC, Joint Direct Attack Missions, i.e. smart bombs. When the B-2 comes after you, there is no place to hide. The B-2 program costs $2.2 billion per plane to build 20 planes. And I don't believe we have any intention of ever building another one. Conclusions. Gladwell is a bit of a gadfly. The data that he quotes in his book does not correspond to the data that I've found in other places. Sometimes he exaggerates high, sometimes he exaggerates low. He wants to quote information that supports the thesis that he's trying to offer. However, it's fascinating that this group of mafia, highly motivated individuals, accomplished what they did in terms of determining American strategy for the greater part of the Second World War. If they are convinced they're right and persistent enough, they can overcome any obstacle. Precision bombing implies limited collateral damage. Don't believe it. The Norden bomb sight that allowed bombardiers, and by the way, the British didn't call them bombardiers, they called them bomb aimers, to pinpoint targets from 15,000 feet failed miserably. The bomb sight was well less than perfect under real conditions. And to go back to Pedden's book, what he said was the degree of accuracy of the American system compared to the British night system was very comparable. Hype beats reality. 12,000, that's not 1,200, it's 12,000 Allied heavy bombers were lost in Europe alone. And that's all, folks. Any questions, or is anybody left?
Yeah, George. Why were they called the Mafia?
Because they were a small group of people that were able to influence a very large contingent of the military, the government. So
That where they
said,
got it? Did they get that from the? Did they get that from the Italians?
I don't know. I don't know where the name came from. No questions, huh?
George,
That was very good.
Yeah.
George, can you, yeah, didn't they give themselves that name?
You know, I don't know. If they did, I did not pick that up.
I read, I'm part way through that book, and I thought they give themselves that name.
You might be right, Jerry. I didn't pick that up, but you might be right.
I might be wrong too, I know.
That's true, you might be. It's really an interesting book. And the thing that surprised me the most was that some of the facts that he quoted don't correlate with what I found in other sources. Specifically,
George,
Schweinfurt.
did they ever develop anything better than the Norden bomb sight during the war?
No. The British developed a bomb sight very similar to the Norden, and so did the Germans.
And George, wasn't it, the precision of bombing really didn't improve until after Vietnam. I mean, they were using the same bombing techniques in Vietnam that they used during World War II.
Yes, they were.
Until they got precision guided weapons, I mean, they were carpet bombing everything.
Yep. And especially in Vietnam, although I don't know about the North, because I don't know what the B-52s were doing in the North. And much of what happened in the North, remember, was fighter bomber stuff. F-4s, A-1s and whatnot.
Yeah, well, that was the most precision bombing in World War II was dive bombers.
That's right. That is right.
Dive bombers are what took out the carriers. I mean,
that is exactly right. The Navy figured out that precision bombing was not a realistic way to attack their targets, and they used dive bombing with a lot more precision than the Army used, or Army Air Corps used with their bombing tactics.
Do you know, is that what Billy Mitchell used to, in his demonstration to blow up that battleship? Wasn't he a dive bomber?
No, but he was at a fairly low level. I don't believe he was a dive bomber. Somebody could correct me if I'm wrong.
No, you're right.
I believe so.
You're right, George. But the problem, not the problem, but Mitchell was bombing a static target, an anchored battleship. The problem with higher level bombing by big bombers is the ship is a moving target, and good ship commanders can see where the bomber is, see where the bombs are dropping and maneuver accordingly. So if you see a lot of World War II bombing of ships like out in the Pacific, you see a lot of misses. So the dive bomber was much more effective. They could stay on target, a moving target, a lot longer than just a high level bomber.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, very good, George.
All right, guys.
Thank you, George.
I enjoyed that.
Thank you, George.
You're welcome. Have a
Have
good
a nice
evening,
weekend, guys.
Very good.
Yeah, I hope you feel better, George. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you.